Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Initial NBA podcast. Today we're going to talk about the Damian Lillard and James Harden situations, what I think are kind of the most likely scenarios in each, and kind of what some of those potential trades might look like. Next after that, we're going to do a new series I'm starting. Obviously, this is episode 1 of the podcast of the Rafter rankings. If we were looking at every NBA team, take a look at who all's played for them, who are the top 5 players all time for each franchise. So today we're starting out that series with what I think was a relatively easy one in terms of this exercise, and I guarantee you they're not all going to be that, is the San Antonio Spurs. You know, we all know some of those dudes, so we're gonna talk through who those top 5 players are, some of their accomplishments, a little bit about their games, and then, I'll do some honorable mentions. Before we get started on both of those, though, just give you some background on me. My name is CJ. What's up? I am been a huge NBA fan all my life, ever since I was, 9, 10 years old on the East Coast, staying up, watching those, Friday night games. East Coast time started like 11:30 was the second game usually, or something like that, 10:30 maybe. So I remember many days of my childhood staying up until, 1:30, 2 in the morning watching NBA. But yeah, a little about me. I'm a huge Nuggets fan. We finally got it done this year. So yeah, that's a little about me. I've been a huge NBA fan, but I've always wanted to learn more. And I feel like this podcast is kind of an opportunity to do that and to share kind of those things I learned about the NBA, starting with the Rafter ranking series. When it comes to Nuggets history, I feel like I have a pretty strong grasp of the guys we've had and where they fit. But, there's a lot of franchises that, I'm familiar with guys of the last 20 years, right? Being someone in my early 30s, I've watched a lot of basketball over the last, 20, 25 years. But, there's a lot of guys from prior eras that I never got a chance to watch. So, series like, the Rafter rankings is kind of me exploring some of these all-timers for these other franchises and learning more about, who they were, their game, the things they accomplished, kind of where they fit within each franchise. The other thing I want to mention is I hope everything that I say on here is I try to be as rational as possible when it comes to talking about basketball and talking about sports. It's kind of one of those things that I feel like is missing with a lot of sports media, especially when it comes to some of those national outlets are always talking about the same things. They're always just kind of saying stuff for reactions and clicks and stuff like that. But, I miss the days of old sports news and Sports Center and Sports Talk Radio and things like that. So I'm hoping I can, kind of help bring an air of rationality when it comes to things that happen in the NBA, things that might happen in the NBA, and things that have already happened in the NBA. So with that, we'll get to the James Harden and Dame Lillard situations. So James Harden and Damian Lillard both have come out in the last, couple months or whatever, requesting trades one way or another. Lillard's been a little more, or at least his agent has been a little more vocal about, he'll only play for Miami, won't be happy anywhere else, that type of thing. Harden's been a little bit more low-key, I think, considering his track record with some of this stuff. Obviously forcing his way out of both Houston and Brooklyn. But I wanted to talk about kind of where these guys may end up, right? It's interesting. They're both very, I guess, similar players in terms of where they are in their careers. Point guards that haven't really won much, both kind of looking for kind of that new start, and both in kind of like a financial situation where, the receiving team's going to have to send a lot of salary out in order to get either one of these guys. So yeah, let's just go over a couple of what I think are like the most likely destinations for these guys. Obviously, a lot of things can change between now and whenever they get traded, if they get traded, but this is who I got. So for Lillard, I think there's kind of 2 more likely outcomes, and then I have a couple dark horse ideas on what could happen. But the first one I think is the most likely scenario. It's the one that we've all been talking about for the last month or two, basically since the NBA Finals, with Lillard going to Miami. With this, it's much more likely to happen if it does, much more likely to happen after August 1st. That's when Jaime Jaquez Jr. is available to be traded. He's not able to be traded until before that date. The thing is, with a trade to the Heat, there's not much for the Heat to offer Portland. They could, it's already been reported by a bunch of people. They could do a package of some combination of Tyler Hero, Nikola Jovic, Jaquez Jr., when he's available to be traded. Whatever picks Miami, could offer. But if you're taking a trade like that, and you probably have to throw in like Duncan Robinson for salary matching purposes. But if you're making a trade like that, if you're Portland, you're kind of only getting like 70 cents on the dollar for who Damian Lillard is, perennial all-NBA type of guy. So while there's worse offers out there, it may make sense for Portland to kind of chill, wait a little bit, see what else kind of unfolds over the next couple months. Especially because at this point, most teams are kind of set with who they've got going into the year. I wouldn't expect too much activity at this point. Now that free agency's over, the draft's over, everyone's kind of set. So while I think the Miami trade is probably the most likely, I could definitely see scenarios where Portland kind of holds pat and sees what else comes up. So kind of the other option I see for the Lillard outside of being traded to Miami is basically just him staying put at least until the trade deadline. Like I said, there's not going to be a lot of movement with players between now and probably January, February anyway. So this kind of fits into kind of what Portland probably should do and is wait, see what else is out there. Lillard's, he's not going anywhere. He's on a 4-year contract. So they have time to kind of hold and, see what happens. Unfortunately, that does make it so that the beginning of the season will there's going to be a lot of distractions, right? If they wait until, if they keep Lillard going into the season, it probably causes some distractions, especially with some of their young guys, which makes it, a balancing act, right? You don't want to lose Damian Lillard for, a whole lot less than what he's worth, right? But you also probably want to keep distractions at a minimum, especially with, some of their young guys they have, Scoot Henderson, Shaedon Sharpe, Anthony Simons, those types of guys. So what I think, could potentially happen is Portland waits until, goes into the season with Lillard, kind of measures what the trade market is for him throughout the first couple months of the season, and potentially jumps on an offer that right now doesn't exist, but come January, February does, based on how the first couple months of the season kind of play out. One team that I had jotted down, which I think would make sense for them, and potentially Portland too, they could get a pretty good offer back, would be Minnesota. Now, I don't know if, obviously you're trading within the Western Conference, but, Portland's probably going to suck for the next couple of years anyway, so I don't think that's as big of a deal as it normally would be. But, Minnesota last year made it to the playoffs, 8th seed, lost to the Nuggets in the first round. But they have that centerpiece in Anthony Edwards. They tried this 2-center thing with Gobert and Cat, which, thus far I don't think has really worked super great, and obviously was a very questionable trade at the time, especially with all the assets they gave up. But obviously out of that, you do have a Defensive Player of the Year center, in Gobert. I think Karl-Anthony Towns, while he's incredibly talented, he is a star. He isn't. It still feels like he's underwhelmed in terms of what he could potentially be, given his skill set and his size and things like that. So if Minnesota decides, hey, we have Anthony Edwards, he's ready to be a superstar, which I think he is. That dude is nuts. As a Nuggets fan, I watched him roast us. Obviously, we won the series, but he scared the crap out of me, probably more than almost anyone else in the playoffs that the Nuggets played. But, if Minnesota decides this 2-center thing isn't working, we probably need to make a decision. We have Anthony Edwards. It wouldn't surprise me necessarily if they end up saying, hey, we're going to keep Gobert. Let's trade Karl-Anthony Towns and essentially do a Lillard for Cat trade. And, Minnesota probably has to throw in a couple other, I don't think they even have any more picks, so you probably have to throw in like Jaden McDaniels or something like that to for Portland to accept it. But it gives Portland someone in Karl-Anthony Towns who is still incredibly talented, so I wouldn't, write him off yet in terms of an NBA player. Obviously, he's a multi-time All-Star. He says he's the best shooting big man of all time, according to him. Not sure I necessarily agree, but whatever. But Portland gets a dude that's probably more with their timeline, right? With Shaedon Sharpe and Scoot Henderson and Anthony Simons. You get a big that is more in line with what Portland's core is going to be in terms of timelines. I think something like that where Portland holds off, waits to see what happens near the trade deadline, then kind of makes a decision from there. Because one of these teams, like I said, whether it's Minnesota, maybe someone like New Orleans, the Clippers, one of these teams is going to end up becoming kind of desperate for a change based on how the first couple weeks of the season go. So that's kind of the two most likely destinations, I think, for Lillard. One being Miami, which has already kind of been discussed ad nauseum through basically everybody that talks about the NBA. And the second one, I think, is probably the more prudent decision for Portland, is just to kind of wait it out, see what other offers are going to be out there. Because in all honesty, the Miami offer probably isn't going anywhere, right? You're going to get that same offer in February, unless, Miami decides to trade for Harden or something like that. So yeah, I think it would make more sense for Portland to just kind of wait. So yeah, those are kind of the two for Lillard. Now for Harden. Harden's tough because there's only one... There's really only one outcome I truly see, and that's him just playing it out with Philadelphia. I know it's been talked about that the Clippers are a potential destination. He wants to go to the Clippers. I don't know why either team would do that. For the Clippers, they already have two oft-injured stars, right? And in order to get Harden, they probably need to either get rid of one of those two stars, or I don't even know if they even have very many young assets to give up. That would make sense for Philadelphia to take, given where they are. So to me, when it comes to Harden, he's a free agent after this year. He is looking for one more big payday, right? So he doesn't really have the leverage to kind of hold out and do what he's done in previous stops in Brooklyn and Houston, where I don't want to say he gives up or quits, but he essentially asked for a trade, and then either, I think with Brooklyn, he ended up sitting out a bunch of games. With Houston, he just kind of played like garbage, at least as far as his standards go, which are obviously very high, so him playing like garbage is still very good. But he doesn't have that leverage to kind of pull that same strategy, given if he does do that, I don't know what team gives him the contract he potentially wants. However, if he stays in Philadelphia, he plays well, they maybe make it past the second round this next year, that maybe gives a team, especially if he's a big part of why they make a deep playoff run, it'll give other teams someone else more incentive to give him kind of that last big multi-year contract he wants. And also, when it comes to Philadelphia, I think I don't hate the idea of them kind of running it back, right? They were up 3-2 on the Celtics in the second round last year. So it's not like they were terrible. It's not like the season was an entire disappointment. Obviously they wanted to make it farther in the playoffs, but, they have almost everyone back, at least everyone of note. I think they lost Niang is the only guy I can think of out of kind of their rotation or almost rotation that they lost. But yeah, they're essentially a couple bad Harden and Embiid games away from making to the Eastern Conference Finals, which if they played the Heat, I feel like that series would have gone a lot differently. And, I think at that point, Philadelphia is a good chance of making the finals. So I wouldn't necessarily be all on board with Philadelphia just blowing it up. I think it makes sense, I think, from Philadelphia's perspective to run it back with Harden and Embiid. Obviously you didn't really lose much in free agency. You have another year of Tyrese Maxey, who was really good last year and obviously is very talented. So, I would expect him to make kind of another maybe smaller step forward next year. And then also you got a new coach, right? Nick Nurse, to me, is a better coach than Doc Rivers. So I think it'd be interesting to see how Philadelphia runs with Nick Nurse as head coach rather than Doc Rivers. So yeah, for me, the most likely Harden destination is he's staying put. One, makes sense for Philly, and then two, Harden basically has no leverage to force his way out like he has in the past. Now, there is one other scenario. These are super dark horse scenarios that probably very unlikely to happen, but I do think they're possible. So these are where we get to wild speculation. So the first one, so essentially these are centered around 3-team trades, where Lillard's going to the 76ers, Harden is going to Team X, which that gets filled in, and then Portland is receiving some compensation back. Again, these are wild speculation. I don't really expect any of these to happen, but there are a couple where I think if things fall in a certain way, especially over the first couple months of the season, if they happened, I wouldn't be utterly shocked. All right, so the first one is the one I like the best. Again, it's very reliant on how this team feels about a certain player. But this one is Lillard to the 76ers, Harden to the New Orleans Pelicans, and then Zion to Portland. Okay, so there need to be some filler. And with all of these, there's going to need to be filler somewhere, right? Which is almost always obtainable in some way, whether it be involving another team somewhere, whatever. Also going to need to be some, obviously, draft capital somewhere. Most teams have something to give, so we're just assuming that can be figured out, right? So you're assuming that we can get salaries match up. We're assuming that draft capital can be figured out. So yeah, these are just like bare bones skeleton. Who are the main guys on this trade? So like with all these, for Philly, it makes sense because they get off Harden, who's already pissed, right? And they get Lillard, who, in my opinion, is an upgrade at point guard. At least at this point in their careers, I think Lillard's a more effective player. It also gives them a player that's going to be with them longer, right? Lillard's on a 4-year contract. I think he has 4 years left. Harden's got a one year left. So if Harden stays with Philly's going to have to figure something out next year on, hey, what are we doing about our point guard? And maybe the answer is internal. Maybe it's Maxey, who to me is more of a 2 guard anyway. But so that's kind of the idea, right? Is Philadelphia gets an upgraded point guard. Harden gets his wish and leaves Philadelphia. And then Portland is able to get some return. So, like I said, first one, Lillard to the 76ers, Harden to New Orleans, Zion to Portland. So there need to be filler. But this one is almost entirely predicated on, hey, does New Orleans believe that Zion is the guy? So Zion obviously is the talent of being the guy, right? Could be a number one option on a championship team. Like, that's how talented the dude is. However, obviously, if you watch the NBA, he's had he's had a lot of injury issues over the last couple of years. I think he's barely played a full season's worth of games. I think it's, maybe a little over 100 in his 4 years. He's had a lot of conditioning issues, which, that's never great. And it sucks for him, right? Because that's a tough thing. It can be a tough thing. But he has these concerns, right? Despite of how talented he is and how athletic he is, now just how much of a freak of nature he is in terms of his athleticism and his ability. He has these health issues that pop up pretty much every year. He's always hurt. And he's got the conditioning things that seem to always show up. And that probably contributes a bit to the injuries, right? Then there's also the what the hell is happening off the court thing, which, I think in a vacuum is probably not a huge deal. But when you combine it with the injury thing, when you combine it with his conditioning, when you combine that, he's played a little over 100 games over the course of his career. Actually, how many games is it exactly? That way I'm not just guessing. I know it's a lot less than you would like. 114 games. Yeah. So 114 games in his career over his 4 years, one of which he didn't play at all because of an injury. So, I can see a world where New Orleans is like, we have these other guys in Ingram and McCollum and Herb Jones and Valanciunas and these guys. What if we can win with someone else at the helm? They don't really have a point guard. CJ McCollum right now, I guess, is their acting point guard. To me, he's more of a shooting guard. So, I think it would be a good fit for Harden in New Orleans. You'd essentially have a lineup of Harden, Ingram, McCollum, Jones, and Valanciunas. That's pretty damn good. Obviously it's all predicated on the Pelicans being tired of Zion, but given you have 4 years of the guy, you're paying him huge amounts of money. He's played 114 games. I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility. And then for Portland, it makes perfect sense, right? In terms of returns you can get for Lillard, if you can Zion Williamson back, that's an incredible return, right? Obviously, same things, deal with injuries, whatever the off-court crap is, I don't know. But if Zion lives up to what he could be, you're essentially trading for the potential, right? We all know what Zion potentially could be, right? Top 5 player in the NBA. If you're the Trailblazers and you're getting a dude that's 23 years old that potentially could be a top 5 player in the NBA, I feel like you have to trade that. You have to do that, especially given the rest of your core is so young. He fits with your timeline much better. And again, this is total dark horse, wild speculation, wild idea. But to me, this trade is one that truly does make sense for all sides, assuming that the Pelicans are wanting to move off of Zion, which they probably don't. I probably would at least give him one more year, but you never know. They could be like, hey, we have an opportunity to cash in right now for this guy. Maybe his value isn't as much as it is next year. Maybe his value goes down over the next year. Maybe he gets hurt again. I could see the Pelicans talking themselves into this to give themselves a chance to win right now. The second one I have is, again, a 3-teamer. This one is Lillard to the 76ers, Harden to the Lakers, and then essentially picks and salary from both Philadelphia and LA going to Portland. This is kind of predicated on just the fact that, hey, LeBron's in his last couple of years in the NBA. His teams have a tendency for kind of big moves. I don't want to say he's forcing those moves, but that's kind of the joke on the internet, which maybe is true, maybe it's not. I have no idea. It might be true. Who knows? But, if the Lakers come out next, obviously they made the Western Conference Finals. They have a good roster with, him, Anthony Davis, re-signed Reeves, re-signed Russell. They have a good team. However, if the first couple months of the season do not pan out the way they're probably hoping, and the two I'm thinking of are, they re-signed Russell, they re-signed Hachimura. Russell was a disaster in the playoffs. I watched that man get owned by Bruce Brown pretty consistently. And then Hachimura was really good after he went to the Lakers last year, but I'm not necessarily convinced he wasn't great in Washington. To me, it's show me you can do it a little bit more before I guess trust you as an NBA player. So I'm just throwing this as like a potential out there that, if Hachimura underperforms, if Russell underperforms, if Reeves underperforms, even though I think he's a damn good player, I can see a world where LeBron says, hey, this is the last rodeo. Anthony Davis is healthy. We need to do something, I can see them doing, Hachimura, Russell, throw in some picks. Let's get someone like James Harden to kind of run the point. Especially another one I didn't mention, Gabe Vincent. If Gabe Vincent doesn't kind of live up to the contract he signed, I could see something like that happening. And again, Portland getting back, young players, salary to match that, they could then flip or, just kind of wait out the contract, I guess, because Portland's not going to be good for the next couple of years. So those are the two I had. People are talking about Harden to the Clippers. I just don't see how that's realistic. I have it on here as as one of my dark horse trades. Lillard to the 76ers, Harden to the Clippers, and then Maxey picks and salary to Portland. Thing is, I know Harden's been linked to the Clippers. I don't know what the Clippers really have to trade. They don't really have much that I don't think Portland's really interested in, which is why in this scenario I had Maxey going to Portland. But at that point, you have the 76ers who are trading essentially Harden and Maxey for Lillard, which that's a bit steep of a price. So I threw it in to my list of dark horse trades because the Clippers have been mentioned basically everywhere for Harden. But honestly, I don't really see how that ends up happening. I guess we'll see how it kind of plays out. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next couple months. Especially because I think, unless the Lillard to the Heat thing happens in the next, couple days, we'll see what happens. But I would expect something probably more towards the trade deadline. So we're in this part of the NBA season where there's not really a lot going on, right? Free agency's over. The draft is over. Season doesn't start, as of today, July 31st. We're talking 3 months, 2 to 3 months until it starts. So we're in this weird lull, right? So what I decided to do is help fill that with this new series I'm doing called the Rafter Rankings. Okay. Now we tend to talk about players and their place in history, everything like that, as a league-wide thing, right? MJ versus LeBron, Will Chamberlain versus Bill Russell, but I wanted to talk about it more on a team-by-team level, right? There are some guys that are obviously the best players to ever play for the team. Michael Jordan, Curry in Golden State. But then there are other guys that are maybe not quite as impactful, but still great players who are top 5 in that franchise's history that we never really talk about. At least not as more of kind of a national type of NBA discussion, right? And within a certain market, yeah, they'll talk about those guys, but as part of the bigger NBA picture, kind of get forgotten. So I'm starting this series called the Rafter Rankings. So essentially think about it like this. Imagine the NBA passed a new rule, right? Every team has to have 5, and exactly 5 players' numbers retired, and their numbers hung in the arena rafters. Now, sometimes this is easy, right? Michael Jordan, obviously the best player to ever play for the Bulls. Curry, obviously the best player to ever play for Golden State. Magic Johnson, he obviously is a top 5 player in Lakers history. But then there are other teams where this becomes a much trickier ask, right? Either one, they just haven't had that many great players come through, if any. I'm sorry to all Charlotte Hornets fans. But also there are other cases where, a team can be almost overstacked, right? You look at LA, you look at the Lakers, you look at Boston. There's so many dudes you could choose to get to that top 5 players in their franchise's history. So this podcast series kind of sets out to go through each team's history, figure out who those 5 players are, and kind of determine their ordering within the top 5 players all time. So today's episode, we're going to talk about the San Antonio Spurs. Now, it's important to understand kind of the criteria for these rankings. Championships are obviously weighed heavily. If you're a fan of a team, that's the ultimate goal, right? Is for a player, whoever that superstar is, to bring your team a championship. So championships are weighed heavily in these rankings. Only the stats and awards, championships that happened while they were on that team were considered. So, as an example, Hakeem Olajuwon, obviously, if you were to take the 5 best players all time to ever play for the Raptors, he's one of them, right? Because he's, a top 15 player all time. But with the Raptors themselves, he's at the end of his career, wasn't great. He wasn't his Houston self. So, Hakeem would not make the Raptors top 5 list. So, important distinction. We're only considering anything that happened while a player was with that franchise. Obviously, that means that there's some players that are part of multiple teams' top 5 lists. Example, LeBron. He's going to be on Cleveland's. I think that one's pretty obvious. He's on Miami's. I think that's pretty obvious. And while I haven't fully fleshed out the Lakers one, there's an outside chance he could be top 5 in Lakers history. Probably not. I still have to go through the research of those guys, but, there's a shot there. So keep that in mind. So today's episode, talking about the Spurs. So there's a couple guys that I want to mention. They're not in any real consideration for top 5 for the Spurs. I think with the Spurs, there's a very obvious top 6, right? I think they have 6 guys that are comfortably the 6th best players that have ever put on a Spurs uniform. But there are a couple guys that need mentioning just because they had good careers in San Antonio. In some cases important to that franchise's story. So here's a couple of the honorable mentions that, I wanted to shout out, but aren't in real consideration. One being James Silas. He started his career with the Spurs in 1972. Back before they were even in San Antonio, they were in the Dallas Chaparrals. First team All-Rookie in 1973, 2-time ABA All-Star, and then 2-time All-ABA team. second in ABA MVP voting. So, this is a guy that was part of the beginning for the Spurs, which kind of makes why I wanted to mention him, because it's important to the Spurs history. He was kind of their first real star, right? When you think about the Spurs, he came in 73. George Gervin came in, a couple years later, and James Silas was kind of the guy to start for that team. A couple other things. Tied for second in ABA MVP. Dr. J destroyed the voting in that. It wasn't even close, but still, second place MVP, that's worth mentioning. Average 16.7 points, couple assists, couple rebounds. One of the best free throw shooters of his time, which I didn't know. And I will mention, this is part of the reason why I'm doing this series is, so I'm a Nuggets fan, right? So I wanted to also learn, I know a lot about Nuggets history, but I don't know nearly as much about other teams. So I see this as kind of a way to learn more about the history of the NBA, and not just about different players, but kind of how the league has changed and who these guys are and what they were great at. So this is one I didn't know. James Silas, one of the best free throw shooters during his time, essentially led the ABA in free throw attempts in 76. It was consistently top 5 in free throw percentage. So, hey, didn't know that. Ended up being traded in 1982. He was the first player in Spurs history to have his number retired by the team, which is interesting. I would have never guessed James Silas as the guy that got his number retired first. I think we all would have thought George Gervin if you're not a huge Spurs history buff. So he had a reputation of playing in the clutch, so much so that Gervin would defer to him in games. So it kind of shows that he was kind of that first star for San Antonio, when kind of next big star, and obviously a much bigger star, was deferring to him during their careers together. Even so, his nickname was Captain Late and the Late Mr. Silas, due to him kind of being a clutch player at the end of games. That's a little bit about James Silas. Not in consideration for top 5, but it's worth mentioning because he's important. And he is kind of one of the what-ifs in Spurs history due to some of his injuries he had. In another alternate reality, maybe he is the best Spur to ever put on a Spur uniform. The other guy that, is in that conversation for top 5, but good player, this is more recent, LaMarcus Aldridge, 3-time All-Star when he was in San Antonio, 2 All-NBA teams, played 6 seasons there. Averaged almost 22 points, 9 rebounds, and 1.4 blocks, and then, helped the team 2 conference finals in the 16-17 season. He even got a couple MVP votes, 17-18 season. If you're, over the age of like 20, you probably know LaMarcus Aldridge, right? Got that mid-range game, fadeaway jumper. So yeah, LaMarcus Aldridge, kind of like Silas, he's a really good player during his time, and, if you're looking at him in maybe a different situation for a different team, he's probably top 5 all time for some other guy, for some other teams. Again, sorry for ripping on Charlotte, but LaMarcus Aldridge would be a top 5 player in Hornets history, easy. And, we know LaMarcus Aldridge probably more known for his time in Portland. So I would expect, I haven't gone through the Portland players all the way, I've kind of gotten my list of top 6 to 8, but I would expect to see him in the top 5 there. So we've gone through those 2 honorable mentions. Now we get to the top 6, right? So these are the 6 that I think have any chance of potentially being in the top 5. And what's interesting about the Spurs is I feel like this is one of the easier rankings when you talk about top 5. And really the only time I had pause was at number 5. I think other than that, and maybe there's some flip and do's between 3 and 4 or whatever where you could argue, but at number 6, so just missing the cut, our last honorable mention, again, he's important to Spurs history, so I'm going to mention him. Spurs fans might want to cover their ears because I don't think they're a huge fan of this guy anymore. But Kawhi Leonard, number 6, all-time Spur. Now, the Spurs have a clear-cut top 5. At first, I was like, Kawhi might be top 5 over Manu Ginobili, just because of the accolades. Manu came off the bench of a lot of his career. Only, I think, 2 All-Stars. It's in my notes here. We'll get to Manu. But with Kawhi, one, Manu is more important, right? Playing, a decade and a half with San Antonio versus Kawhi, who only played there for 7 seasons. And if we're being real, he really didn't start coming into his own until year 4 or 5. Before that, he's more of a kind of defensive specialist, very raw player. It took him a while to kind of find his footing on kind of the offensive end, even though defensively he was kind of always a monster. So I think you could argue Kawhi top 5, potentially, especially if you're one that never watched Manu Ginobili play and, or maybe just looking at awards, finals MVP, whatever. but I couldn't do that to Manu, so I have Kawhi Leonard at number 6 and just outside the top 5. So, you guys know this guy, but technically he was drafted by the Pacers, 15th overall, 2012 draft. Traded to the Spurs on draft day. I think it was for George Hill, if I'm not mistaken. So that might be one that Indiana would want back. He ended up being traded during the 17-18 season after an injury where he pretty much missed the whole season. And that was where he requested a trade due to kind of disagreements between him and the Spurs on how his injury kind of was handled. And he ended up getting traded to Toronto in 2018, and we all kind of know that story. We'll get to Toronto eventually with these rankings. With this, I remember that trade. That trade saga was super weird. I think it was his uncle. Is it Uncle Dennis? Pretty sure it was Uncle Dennis was involved in whatever way, and he was speaking for Kawhi. Kawhi had removed himself from the team completely, and it was weird. And that's part of the reason why, as I've heard, Spurs fans not real big on the Kawhi bandwagon nowadays. I'm sure it's not as bad as it used to be, and I'm sure it'll get better still. But, I get it. As a Nuggets fan, I lived through the Carmelo Anthony saga, and it really sucks when your player says, nah, I don't want to play here no more. So I get it. But yeah, Kawhi Leonard, 2-time All-Star with the Spurs, 2-time All-NBA first team, 4 All-Defensive teams, top 3 in MVP voting twice, and then 2-time Defensive Player of the Year. So, when you look at his resume, even just with the Spurs, that isn't considering anything to do with the Clippers or Toronto. It's a ridiculous resume. Like that, and, to cap it off, his key piece in their 2014 run, won Finals MVP, had one of the highest 2 to 3 year peaks you could have between the championship, Finals MVP, second in regular season MVP, Defensive Player of the Year awards, first team All-NBA. The dude was disgusting. So yeah, during the Spurs, averaged 16 points, 6 rebounds, 1.8 steals. The Claw getting his steals, board man, gets paid. So yeah, came in as a project, especially on the offensive end, but left being one of the better scorers in the NBA, especially from the mid-range, and the dude still does work in the mid-range. He's 100% going to be a Hall of Famer. It's just, with his first 7 years becoming a San Antonio, him not really becoming Kawhi until year 4 or 5. Yeah, he misses the cut for the Spurs all-time top 5. Those are those honorable mentions, throwing them out there just because they deserve to be mentioned. They're, Silas, Aldridge, Kawhi. There are probably some other guys you can consider honorable mention: Sean Elliott, Bruce Bowen. But those are just the 3 I went with. So don't yell at me if there's another guy that you think should be honorable mention. All right, now for the actual top 5. Now for number 5, we got Manu Ginobili, obviously. Drafted in the second round. Didn't even come over to the Spurs for 2 years until he was 25 years old. So a bit of an older rookie. Played 16 years with the Spurs. Finally retired in the 17-18 season. Only 2 All-Stars appearances. 2-time third-team All-NBA. A second-team All-Rookie. But he also won 6th Man of the Year award in 2008. And he was a key member of the Spurs, kind of on all 4 of their championships in that span between 2003 and 2014. In terms of all-time players, right, Manu Ginobili probably doesn't get a lot of the love he deserves. Part of that because he came off the bench for most of his career. He was still a 2-time All-Star, 2-time All-NBA. But can you only imagine if he started? And I get that he did what the team needed of him, right? And, it obviously worked out winning the championships. But, I think we'd be talking about Manu Ginobili kind of in a different light if he isn't coming off the bench for 75% of his career. He was in the Hall of Fame, one of the all-time great 6-man and team players, obviously. Definitely a top player in the NBA during his time, but still came off the bench. Numbers don't pop out. Again, has to do with the bench thing, but averaged 14 points, 4 rebounds, 3.8 assists, 1.3 steals. But, he's 3rd all-time in Spurs history in games played, which I didn't know. 1st all-time in 3-point makes, 3-point attempts, and steals in Spurs history. So, he's one of the best players in Spurs history, one of the best international players ever. And while he wasn't the first guy to use it, he is kind of the one that brought the Euro step to commonality in the NBA game. There were other guys who used it before him who played in the NBA, other guys from Europe. But he was the one that I think kind of made it so that's just a move everyone uses. And obviously it's, been perfected since by a lot of dudes. But I think Manu's kind of that initial guy. So yeah, well, when you're looking at numbers, looking at awards, and this is one where you kind of have to watch him play. But if you're just kind of going off of those things, probably not top 5 in Spurs history. Probably would go to Kawhi, right? But when you talk about, how long he played in San Antonio, part of 4 championship teams, still has some awards, 6th man of the year, and just the importance he had to that franchise and how important he was to those teams, that you have to give him that 5 spot. And honestly, you could probably put him at 4, and I don't think I'd argue very hard. Well, he had his number retired by the Spurs in 2019. Clutch dude. Had a game-winning layup first round against the Suns in double OT in 2008. And then we've all seen the block on Harden to seal Game 5 against the Rockets in the 27 playoffs in the Western semis. And then he hit the game-winning 3 in Game 1 of the West semis 2013 against the Warriors. So dude was clutch. Dude was aggressive driving to the basket. Again, utilizing that Euro step, but it's great. Like, watch some of his highlights. The dude dunks on guys. He's getting crazy acrobatic layups. He's got one of the best passers of his generation and was just stupid crafty. So if you've not seen Manu Ginobili play, please go watch his greatest hits, his highlights, because they're up there with almost anybody. They're pretty nuts, and they're different too. They're so good. Go watch it. Good defensive player as well, leading all Spurs all time in steals. It was regularly got all defensive team votes, even though he never made one, which is kind of ridiculous. So that's Manu Ginobili at number 5. Number 4, I think you guys probably know who this is. It is Manu's longtime teammate, Mr. Tony Parker. Drafted by Spurs in 2001 at number 28 overall. Played 17 seasons in San Antonio, where he finally left and played with Charlotte for that one season, which was weird. He's part of the core with Manu, and then we'll get to Tim Duncan, obviously. If you take any one of those 3 guys off those Spurs teams in that span of, 15 years, constantly making the playoffs, those teams are definitely not the same. Tony Parker, starting point guard, more accolades than Manu Ginobili. 6-time All-Star, 4-time All-NBA, first-team All-Rookie, Finals MVP, which I did not know he won a Finals MVP in 2007, where he averaged 25 points per game during that series. So yeah, 4-time champion, NBA Hall of Fame, was regularly at least kind of in that MVP conversation. His highest finish was 5th in the 2012 season, number retired by San Antonio. Pure point guard, you look at 15.8 points, 5.7 assists on almost 50% shooting, which is pretty crazy when you consider his game, if you watched him, was a lot of mid-range and getting to the basket and was never really a great 3-point shooter. Nowadays it would be weird if that's your point guard, right? But 15 years ago, it worked for Tony Parker, and honestly, he'd still be an effective player today. Let's not kid ourselves. So one of the all-time Spurs, all-time leader in assists by a bunch. This is the best point guard San Antonio's ever had. He was one of the quickest players of kind of that 2000 to like 20, early 2010s. He did a lot of his work in the paint. He was never a really good jump shooter, but he would drive to the basket. He hit that little teardrop layup all the time. And he's basically like a washing machine. I don't know if I've never seen a man do so many spin moves driving to the basket. But yeah, great passer, great handles. Important piece of those Spurs teams. They're not winning 4 championships without him. But, while he's not quite as flashy as Ginobili was, he has the longevity championships. He has the awards, the All-NBA, the All-Stars. That put him at top 4, that number 4 spot in Spurs history. Next up, got number 3, the Iceman, George Gervin. This is going a little farther back. He was acquired in 1974 from the Virginia Squires of the ABA. And this is something I didn't know, which I found very, kind of interesting. But apparently, in 1974, George Gervin was traded from the Squires to the San Antonio Spurs during All-Star Weekend. On the day of the All-Star game. And it was George Gervin's first ever All-Star game, and apparently, in the ABA during those times, they were, some of those teams had some money issues. Essentially, the Virginia Squires were just having a fire sale on everybody, just trying to raise cash so they wouldn't go under. So, yeah, I didn't know that. He got traded during All-Star weekend and technically played his first ever All-Star game as a member of the Spurs before he ever played a game with the Spurs. So I found that interesting. And I guess the ABA commissioner also tried to block that trade because the Squires were in a bad spot financially. So they were basically selling off all of their best players. ABA commissioner didn't want that to happen, obviously, because that's definitely not good for your league. But ultimately, it went through. So yeah, George Gervin ended up playing 12 years in San Antonio before he was traded to the Bulls in 1985. Also played with Michael Jordan. Just like Parker and Manu, part of the NBA 75th anniversary team. You know, Gervin was also part of the NBA 50 greatest players team and also was an ABA all-time team. He was an all-star every single year in San Antonio, which you don't find that very often. A dude 12 straight all-star appearances with the same team, especially when you consider injuries, up and down years. Like, the dude was a problem like his entire career. 9-time all NBA / all ABA. 5 first team, 4 second team. You know, was top 5 in MVP voting 4 different times. And he was second twice. In 1978, where he lost to Bill Walton. 1979, where he lost to Moses Malone. So back then it was a big man's game. The big man won the MVPs. But George Gervin was right there coming in second twice. He was just a scorer, dude. Led the NBA in scoring 4 times, including 3 straight years from 77-78 to 79-80. He is one of 3 players ever to average 30 per game on better than 50% shooting as a guard during a season. And the other 2 dudes on that list are Steph Curry and Michael Jordan. You know, it's funny that George Gervin is, I mean, he was one of the best, if not the best player of the mid to late 70s to the early 80s, but I feel like he does not get mentioned enough. Like the dude, his accolades are pretty ridiculous. He was the one that perfected the finger roll. That was his go-to, driving to the basket, finger roll, just over 7-footers all day long. Like, if you go watch his highlights, like, he is cool and smooth as hell. That was his game. The finger roll kind of fits that kind of perfectly. You know, if you have a smooth game, you'd expect kind of this smooth looking shot to be your calling card. But yeah, so it's so, he makes it look so easy in some of these highlight clips. You're just like, are you trying? It looks like he's not trying sometime. So yeah, the Iceman, you know, we're mentioning nicknames a lot because I love it. That all these dudes have nicknames. Iceman fits. It's a 10 out of 10 nickname for George Gervin, 100%. If he was on many other teams, he'd be the best player to ever play on that franchise. But unfortunately for him and this list, that doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. There are 2 big men that they're 2 of the greatest big men of all time ahead of him on this list, so you can't really fault him. Number 2, I don't think there's much surprise here. You got David Robinson. You know, drafted by the Spurs first overall in 87, but couldn't play with the Spurs until 1989 because he was drafted out of the Naval Academy. You don't see that too often anymore. So, yeah, he essentially had his mandatory military service, which, if you didn't know, is kind of standard with, different service academies. So, after college, he had to do 2 years of military service. So, he didn't come to the Spurs until 1989, even though he was drafted first overall in 1987. And also, obviously, that's where the Admiral nickname comes from. Again, very fitting. So, yeah, played all 14 years in San Antonio. Retired after winning the 2003 title. Again, like the other guys on this list that we mentioned, top 75 all-time NBA list, top, NBA's 50 greatest players team. Basically won every award under the sun. Rookie of the Year in 1990. Defensive Player of the Year in 92. MVP in 95. 2 other years where he finished in second in MVP voting. And then, 10-time All-NBA, 8-time All-Defense. The dude made All-Defense, second-team All-Defense, and third-team All-NBA as a freaking rookie. Like, it's not often you see a dude that dominant, like, immediately. And it probably helped that he was 2 years older than a normal rookie at that time. But still, that's kind of crazy that he was that dominant like right away. I guess it helps when you're a freak athlete and 7 foot tall, but still. And this kind of goes to show his athleticism. He's only one of 4 players to have a quadruple double. So we talk about triple doubles all the time, but there's only been 4 quadruple doubles, which in this case, it was in 1994, 34 points, 10 rebounds, 10 assists, and 10 blocks. So that kind of shows what his all-around game was. While with the Spurs, 21 points a game, 10.6 rebounds, 3 blocks throughout his career, and 1.4 steals. So you're talking, you're almost at 5 stocks total. That's a disgusting defensive impact because there are not many players, especially nowadays, that are hitting those type of numbers, especially over the course of a career, let alone like a season. So yeah, led the NBA in scoring in 1994. Famously, he scored 71 points on the last day of the season to win the scoring title. So imagine going in, last game of the season, you're up on David Robinson by 71, some amount of points that are very high, and you're like, I'm going to win the scoring title. And then David Robinson says, yeah, I'm going to score 71. I'm going to take that scoring title. And that's just rude. So yeah, had 2 other seasons where he was top 5 in scoring in the NBA. Led the NBA in rebounds in 91, which is his second year in the league. Still crazy to think about how young he was, at least NBA career-wise. Top 5 4 other seasons. Led the NBA in blocks twice, in 91 and 92. Top 5 in 7 other seasons. For you advanced stat nerds, which I am one of them, led the NBA in per for 3 straight seasons from 94 to 96. And then there were a bunch of other years where he was first in just choose your advanced stat. He was probably first at some point during his career. Talking about box plus minus, win shares, VORP, whatever. Choose your advanced stat. David Robinson was probably first at some point in that stat during his career. So yeah, one of only 2 players to win a scoring title, Defensive Player of the Year. Fun fact, didn't know that. So yeah, in terms of his game, great offensively, dominant defensively, ridiculously quick jumper in terms of jumping to block shots, elite shot blocker. He was their defensive anchor for those Spurs teams that were always in the top of the league in defense. Offensively, he had a quick first step, ridiculous athlete. And he had a decent enough jump shot to kind of keep defenses honest. They couldn't just kind of sag off for him driving to the basket because he had a decent enough jump shot. He was a good passer, so good that he was able to, it's one of those things where he was one of the most dominant players of his time, but he was still able to share the floor with Tim Duncan early on in Duncan's career. That says a lot, not just about as he is as a player, team player, whatever, but also just the versatility the dude had, because you're taking a natural center and then you're drafting, while I know Duncan is the best power forward of all time, he's basically a center and played center at some points during his career. So the fact that Robinson was able to kind of fit in with that and they won with that says a lot about his versatility, both offensively and defensively. God, that defense would scare the crap out of me. Even with David Robinson being a couple years older, between Robinson and Duncan, if those are the 2 dudes you had to drive the paint against, that's just horrifying, especially if you're a guard in the NBA. So yeah, there's David Robinson, number 2 all-time Spur. I don't think there's going to be a lot of argument for that. The dude was discussing. Now, finally, I've mentioned him a couple times, and probably one of the easiest dudes to rank of this entire series. Yeah, number 1 is going to be the big fundamental, Tim Duncan. Drafted first overall in 1997. This is one of the easiest ones. You have Michael Jordan, Chicago, at number 1. And you have Tim Duncan, and you have Hakeem Olajuwon, number 1 in Houston. There aren't too many others that are like, oh yeah, that guy's definitely number 1 for that team all time, and it's not even close. But Duncan is one of them. Played 19 years with the Spurs, won 5 championships before retiring in 2016. NBA top 75 anniversary team, regularly considered the best power forward of all time. I agree. Tim Duncan is the best power forward of all time. Let's not overthink it. Tim Duncan is the best power forward of all time. He's the best Spur of all time. Back-to-back MVPs in 2002 and 2003. 3-time Finals MVP. 15-time All-Star. Rookie of the Year. 15-time All-NBA. So this man is like, yeah, if I'm an All-Star, I'm All-NBA. With 10 of those being first team, 3 seconds, 2/3. Oh, and not only that, hey, he's an all-around player, guys. 15-time all-defense as well. 8 firsts, 7 seconds. Dude's disgusting offensively. Dude's disgusting defensively. One of the most dominant big men in NBA history. He averaged 19 points per game, 10.8 rebounds, 2.2 blocks. I'm gonna be real. I thought the points per game would be a little higher career-wise, but like everyone, you play 19 years. Those last couple of years are gonna be a little slower, which kind of are helping to drag that average down a little bit. But yeah, almost 20 points a game, 10.8 rebounds, 2.2 blocks. Pretty much every year was near the top of the league in rebounding and blocks, especially during his prime. And like David Robinson, you choose an advanced stat. Tim Duncan was probably near the top of that list most of the time during his career. So he is one of the best defensive bigs of all time, at his peak especially. One of the best defensive bigs of all time, protecting the rim. Always gather a bunch of votes for Defensive Player of the Year every single year. But he never won, which is interesting. That he never won Defensive Player of the Year, yet he is one of the best defensive bigs of all time. We know his nickname, the Big Fundamental. I don't want to say he was boring as a player, because he wasn't boring, but he wasn't dunking on dudes' faces and crossing dudes up. He was like, I'm going to back down, post up, turn around jumper, rip through, baby hook, whatever. Like, all the post moves. That's what Tim Duncan has, all the post moves. And then, kind of one of his more famous shots, the bank shot, right? He didn't use it, I guess, quite as much as we all, I guess, seem to think. But that's kind of what he was kind of known for, was that bank shot on his face-ups. And then, given how much offensive attention he got, he ended up becoming a pretty good passer too, obviously from the post, kickouts, things like that, and then outlets on defensive rebounds. So that's Tim Duncan at number one. So, let's recap. We're talking about the Spurs Rafter rankings, top 5 all time. At number 5, Manu Ginobili. Number 4, Tony Parker. Number 3, George Gervin. Number 2, David Robinson. Number 1, Tim Duncan. In terms of this team, these 5 guys, I don't know if there's really much of an argument for any of these guys to kick them out. You maybe could, swap a couple guys. Maybe you swap Tony Parker and Manu. Maybe you swap George Gervin and David Robinson, maybe. But yeah, the Spurs top 5 all-time team is kind of stacked. And when you think about what these top 5 guys are, you could make a probably pretty good cohesive team with these dudes. It's not like some, I'm sure as we get into other teams with these Rafter rankings, they're going to be really guard heavy, where they're going to be like, 4 of their top 5 are all guards, and maybe the 5th one's a wing. Some teams will have a bunch of bigs where you're like, who the hell would even handle the ball if you were making this imaginary 5-man lineup of these guys? But I mean, if you talk about this team with, Parker at the point, Manu at the 2, Gervin at the 3, and then David Robinson and Duncan kind of playing their, 2 big lineup that they did in the late 90s, you have a pretty good, pretty solid actual defensive team, or, cohesive NBA team or lineup with these guys. So yeah, that's the Spurs top 5 all time. Thanks for listening to the Initial NBA Show, Episode 1. Don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to follow on all the socials at Initial NBA Show, Instagram, Threads, YouTube, whatever one Elon is calling Twitter nowadays. Next time we'll be tackling the Portland Trail Blazers top 5 players ever as part of our Rafter ranking series. Touch on some current NBA news. I know recently Jaylen Brown and Anthony Davis received extensions, so maybe we talk about that. Possibly talk about some of the new rule changes for this coming year. And, who knows, maybe something else pops up in the next couple weeks that becomes a new hot topic. So, again, thanks for listening, and have a great week.